The morning mist clung to the banks of the Rubicon River like ghostly fingers, as if the very air itself knew that history would pivot on this moment. Julius Caesar stood at the water's edge, his weathered hands gripping the reins of his horse, staring across the shallow stream that separated his province of Gaul from the Roman heartland. Behind him, the 13th Legion waited in perfect formation, their bronze armor gleaming despite the gray dawn, their eagle standards snapping in the cold wind. But this moment didn't begin here, at this fateful river crossing. It began nearly a decade earlier, in the year 58 BCE, when Caesar first set foot in Gaul as its newly appointed governor. At 42 years old, he was already a man of considerable ambition, but also crushing debt. The Roman political machine demanded wealth to fuel power, and Caesar needed both if he was to compete with his rivals Pompey and Crassus. Gaul stretched before him like a vast untamed wilderness, a patchwork of Celtic tribes, dense forests, and mysterious druids. The Romans called it Gallia Comata, long-haired Gaul, for the flowing locks of its fierce warriors. These weren't the civilized peoples of the Mediterranean. These were the descendants of those who had once sacked Rome itself 3 centuries earlier. Their very existence was both a threat and an opportunity. Caesar's first challenge came swiftly. The Helvetii, a powerful Celtic tribe from what we now call Switzerland, had decided to migrate westward, seeking new lands. Their movement threatened Roman allies, giving Caesar the perfect excuse to intervene. As he watched their massive wagon trains, carrying entire families, livestock, and belongings, wind through the Alpine passes, Caesar saw not just a military threat, but a chance to prove himself. The Battle of Bibracte would become Caesar's first masterpiece of tactical brilliance. As the Helvetii warriors charged up the hillside, their long swords gleaming, and their war cries echoing across the valley, Caesar deployed his legions in a perfect defensive formation. The Romans stood like a wall of bronze and iron, their shields locked together, their pillow-heavy javelins, ready to rain death upon their enemies. When the Celtic charge broke against the Roman shields like waves against a cliff, Caesar's trap was sprung. His cavalry, hidden in the woods, swept around the flanks while his reserve cohorts advanced from the rear. The Helvetii, caught between hammer and anvil, were crushed. Nearly 250,000 Celts were killed or captured, and Caesar had won his first great victory. But conquest is never just about battles. Caesar understood that to truly control Gaul, he needed to understand its people. He studied their customs, learned their languages, and formed alliances with chieftains who saw opportunity in Roman partnership. The Gauls were not a unified nation but a collection of tribes, each with their own ambitions and grudges. Caesar played them against each other with the skill of a master musician plucking strings. The Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine presented a different challenge. Ariovistus, their king, had already established himself in Gaul, claiming territory and threatening Roman allies. When Caesar demanded his withdrawal, Ariovistus's response was defiant. "What business do you have in my Gaul?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to the gods themselves. Caesar's response was swift and decisive. He marched his legions across the Rhine on a massive wooden bridge constructed by his engineers in just 10 days. The sound of Roman hammers echoing across the water struck terror into Germanic hearts. No Roman army had ever crossed the Rhine in such force. Caesar spent 18 days in Germanic territory burning villages and demonstrating Roman power, before withdrawing and destroying the bridge behind him. It was a message written in fire and steel. Rome's reach knew no bounds. The conquest of Britain followed a similar pattern of psychological warfare combined with military might. Caesar's first crossing of the English Channel in 55 BCE was as much about glory as territory. The Romans called Britain the edge of the world, a mysterious island shrouded in mist and inhabited by painted warriors who fought from war chariots. When Caesar's ships appeared on the horizon, the Britons gathered on the white cliffs, their war paint gleaming, their chariots racing along the beach. The landing was treacherous. The Roman ships, built for Mediterranean waters, struggled in the Atlantic swells. The Britons attacked from the surf, their spears and arrows finding gaps in Roman armor. It was the legion's standard-bearer who turned the tide, leaping from his ship into the churning waters, holding the sacred eagle high above his head, and crying, "Leap, fellow soldiers, unless you wish to betray your eagle to the enemy." Caesar's second invasion of Britain the following year was more successful. With 800 ships and 5 legions, he pushed inland beyond the Thames, defeating the war chariots and taking hostages from the tribal kings. But Britain was not yet ready for Roman rule. Caesar withdrew, content with having shown that Roman eagles could fly even to the world's edge. The true test of Caesar's Gallic conquest came with the Great Rebellion of 52 BC. Vercingetorix, a young chieftain of the Arverdi tribe, had done what many thought impossible. He had united the Gallic tribes against Rome. This wasn't just another tribal skirmish. This was a war for the soul of Gaul itself. Vercingetorix was everything Caesar was not. Young where Caesar was mature, impulsive where Caesar was calculating, passionate where Caesar was pragmatic. But he possessed something that made him dangerous: the ability to inspire men to die for an idea. Under his leadership, the Gauls adopted a scorched earth policy, burning their own towns and crops to deny the Roman supplies. It was a strategy born of desperation, but it worked. Caesar found himself in the most precarious position of his career. His legions were scattered across Gaul, winter was approaching, and his supply lines were under constant attack. Many of his Gallic allies had switched sides, and there were rumors that even Rome itself was questioning his command. For the first time in his career, Caesar faced the possibility of total defeat. The siege of Gergovia, Vercingetorix's stronghold, became a disaster for Caesar. The assault on the hilltop fortress failed, and Caesar was forced to retreat, something he had never done before. The defeat sent shockwaves through the Roman world. The man who had conquered half of Europe had been beaten by a Gallic chieftain barely half his age. But Caesar was not finished. He knew that Vercingetorix's greatest strength, his ability to unite the tribes, was also his greatest weakness. A united Gaul required a single leader, and if that leader could be defeated, the entire rebellion would collapse. Caesar began a campaign of psychological warfare, withdrawing his legions to make Vercingetorix think he was retreating, then suddenly turning to attack isolated Gallic forces. The final confrontation came at Alasia, a fortress city perched on a plateau that seemed impregnable. Vercingetorix had gathered his entire army there, believing that the Romans would never dare to attack such a position. But Caesar had learned from his defeat at Gergovia. Instead of attacking the fortress directly, he built a wall around it. The siege of Alasia became one of the most remarkable military engineering feats in history. Caesar's legions constructed two walls, one facing the city to prevent anyone from escaping, and another facing outward to protect against relief forces. Between these walls, the Romans created a killing ground filled with traps, stakes, and hidden pits. They called it the circumvallation and contravallation, a fortress built to capture a fortress. For weeks, the siege continued. Inside Alasia, food ran out, and the defenders were forced to eat their horses, then their leather goods, then nothing at all. Vercingetorix watched his people starve while Caesar's legions grew stronger with each passing day. When the Gallic relief army finally arrived, 250,000 warriors from across Gaul, they found themselves trapped between Caesar's walls and the fortress they had come to save. The final battle was apocalyptic. The Gallic relief force attacked Caesar's outer wall while Vercingetorix's warriors sallied forth from Alasia to strike the inner wall. Caesar's legions found themselves fighting on two fronts simultaneously, their lines stretched to the breaking point. At the crucial moment, with his center wavering and his flanks under pressure, Caesar himself took up a shield and sword and led his cavalry in a desperate charge around the enemy's flank. The sight of their commander, resplendent in his scarlet cloak, fighting alongside common soldiers, electrified the Roman troops. They surged forward with renewed vigor, and the Gallic line began to crack. When Caesar's cavalry appeared behind the relief army, panic spread through the Celtic ranks. The 250,000 warriors who had come to save Wallachia broke and ran, abandoning their weapons and their hopes. From the walls of Wallachia, Vercingetorix watched his last hope disappear into the forest. The young chieftain who had united Gaul now faced the hardest decision of his life. He could fight to the death, taking his people with him, or he could surrender and save their lives. In the end, love for his people overcame pride. Vercingetorix donned his finest armor, mounted his best horse, and rode out to surrender to Caesar. The meeting between the two great enemies was brief but charged with emotion. Caesar, now 52 years old, and graying at the temples, looked upon the young Gallic chieftain with something approaching respect. Vercingetorix, barely 30, still carried himself with the pride of a king even as he threw his weapons at Caesar's feet. Few words were exchanged, but both men understood that this moment marked the end of an age. Caesar's conquest of Gaul was complete. In 8 years of campaigning, he had added a territory the size of modern France, Belgium, and parts of Germany to the Roman Empire. Over 1 million Gauls were dead, another million enslaved, and an entire civilization had been transformed forever. The wealth that flowed back to Rome was staggering, enough gold to pay off Caesar's debts and fund his political ambitions for years to come. But conquest always comes at a price. Caesar's long absence from Rome had allowed his enemies to grow stronger and more numerous. The first triumvirate, his alliance with Pompey and Crassus, had crumbled. Crassus was dead, killed fighting the Parthians in the eastern desert, and Pompey had allied himself with Caesar's enemies in the Senate. The very success that had made Caesar wealthy and famous had also made him the most dangerous man in Rome. The Senate's ultimatum was clear: disband your armies and return to Rome as a private citizen, or be declared an enemy of the state. Caesar knew what this meant. Without his legions to protect him, his enemies would destroy him through the courts, seizing his wealth and sending him into exile or worse. Everything he had fought for, everything he had built, would be lost. Which brings us back to that misty morning at the Rubicon River. Caesar sat on his horse, knowing that the decision before him would echo through history. Behind him lay 8 years of conquest, glory, and transformation. Ahead lay either the greatest gamble of his life or certain destruction. The river itself was unremarkable, barely knee-deep, and no wider than a large stream. But it represented the sacred boundary between Caesar's provincial command and the Roman heartland. No general was permitted to cross it with his army. Caesar's officers watched their commander in silence. They had followed him through the forests of Gaul, across the Rhine, and over the English Channel. They had seen him share their hardships, risk his life in battle, and lead them to victory after victory. Now they waited to see if he would ask them to follow him into civil war. The moment stretched like a taut bowstring. Caesar closed his eyes and thought of Vercingetorix, who had chosen to surrender rather than see his people destroyed. He thought of his daughter Julia, dead now these 5 years, who had been the bridge between him and Pompey. He thought of Rome itself, the city that had made him but now threatened to destroy him. When Caesar opened his eyes, his decision was made. He spurred his horse forward into the shallow water. As the cold stream swirled around his mount's legs, he spoke the words that would reshape the ancient world. Alia acta state. The die is cast. The 13th Legion followed their commander across the Rubicon, their hobnailed boots splashing through the water, their eagles glinting in the morning sun. With each step, they left the Roman Republic behind and marched toward the empire that would bear Caesar's name for centuries to come. What do you think drove Caesar to make this fateful decision? Was it ambition, fear, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss how this single moment changed the course of Western civilization forever. The flames danced higher, casting flickering shadows across the crowded marketplace of Rouen. Through the smoke and heat, A 19-year-old peasant girl lifted her eyes to heaven, her lips moving in silent prayer. The English soldiers surrounding the pyre jeered and called for her death. But Joan of Arc seemed to hear only the voices that had guided her since childhood, the voices of saints that had transformed a simple farm girl into the savior of France. This story begins not with fire, but with flowers. In the village of Domremy, nestled in the rolling hills of northeastern France, young Joan tended her father's sheep in meadows that seemed untouched by the war raging across the land. It was the year 1424, and France was dying. The 100 Years' War had dragged on for nearly a century, turning the once proud kingdom into a wasteland of burned villages and broken dreams. Joan was 12 years old when she first heard the voice. She was in her father's garden, helping with the harvest, when suddenly the world around her seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. The voice of the archangel Michael spoke to her as clearly as if he stood beside her, telling her that she had been chosen by God to save France and see the Dauphin crowned as king. At first, Joan thought she was dreaming. She was just a peasant girl. She couldn't even read or write. What could she possibly do to save a kingdom? But the voices persisted, joined by those of Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine, appearing to her in visions of incredible beauty and power. They told her of her destiny, of how she would drive the English from French soil and restore the rightful king to his throne. The France of Joan's youth was a nation divided against itself. The English, led by the formidable Henry V, had conquered much of the north, including Paris itself. The French nobility was split between those who supported the Dauphin Charles and those who allied themselves with the English-backed Burgundians. Worst of all, the Dauphin himself seemed to lack the will to fight, hiding in his castles while his people suffered. Joan's family, the Darcs, were simple farmers who had seen their village burned and rebuilt multiple times. Her father, Jacques, was a man of the soil who believed in hard work and prayer. Her mother, Isabel, was devout and kind, teaching Joan the prayers and stories of the saints. Neither could have imagined that their daughter would one day stand before kings and lead armies into battle. The voices grew stronger as Joan reached adolescence. They came to her in the fields, in the church, even in her dreams. Saint Michael appeared to her in shining armor, his sword blazing with heavenly fire. Saint Margaret, the patron saint of peasants, spoke to her of courage and faith. Saint Catherine, the virgin martyr, taught her about sacrifice and devotion to God. Each vision left Joan more convinced that she had been chosen for a purpose greater than herself. When Joan was 16, the voices became urgent. They told her that she must go to the Dauphin and convince him to give her an army. Orleans, the last great city loyal to the French crown, was under siege by the English. If Orleans fell, France would fall with it. Joan knew that her time had come. Convincing her parents was impossible. When Joan told them of her divine mission, they thought she had lost her mind. Her father even threatened to drown her himself rather than see her bring shame on the family. But Joan's faith was unshakable. She knew that God had called her, and no earthly power could stand in her way. Joan's first step toward destiny came when she convinced her uncle, Durand Lassois, to take her to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs. There, she sought an audience with Robert de Baudricourt, the local commander. When she appeared before him, dressed in her simple red dress, and declared that she had been sent by God to save France, Baudricourt laughed in her face. "Send her back to her father," he told Lassois. "Give her a good slapping and let that be the end of it." But Joan would not be deterred. She returned to Vaucouleurs again and again, each time with greater confidence and authority. She began to make predictions that came true, military defeats that she said would happen and did. Slowly, some of the soldiers began to believe. When she accurately predicted a major French defeat at the Battle of Rouvray, even Baudricourt began to listen. Joan's breakthrough came when she made a prediction that seemed impossible. She said that the Dauphin would give her an army before the middle of Lent, and that she would raise the siege of Orleans. The prediction was so specific and bold that even her supporters worried she had gone too far. But June remained calm and certain. "I must be at the king's side," she told Baudricourt, "even if I must wear my legs down to the knees getting there." Finally, convinced by her unwavering faith and her accurate predictions, Baudricourt agreed to send her to the Dauphin. But the journey to Chinon, where the Dauphin held court, was treacherous. The roads were controlled by English and Burgundian forces, and bandits preyed on travelers. Joan would have to travel nearly 300 miles through enemy territory. Joan cut her hair short and dressed as a man for the journey. She wore a simple tunic, hose and boots, and carried a sword at her side. When people asked her why she had adopted men's clothing, she replied simply that God had commanded it. The small party that accompanied her marveled at her courage and determination as they rode through the dangerous countryside. The journey took 11 days, much of it traveling at night to avoid enemy patrols. Joan's companions later said that she seemed to know exactly which routes to take, as if guided by an invisible hand. When they finally reached Chinon, Joan was exhausted but triumphant. She had made it to the Dauphin's court, just as the voices had promised. But her greatest test was yet to come. The Dauphin, Charles VII, was a weak and indecisive man who had been told by advisers that this peasant girl was either mad or a witch. When Joan was brought before him, he decided to test her. He disguised himself as a common courtier and had another man sit on the throne in royal robes. Joan entered the great hall of Chinon Castle, where hundreds of nobles and courtiers had gathered to see the peasant girl who claimed to speak with saints. The hall was magnificent, with soaring stone arches, colorful banners, and the golden fleur-de-lis of France gleaming in the torchlight. But Joan's eyes swept over the false king without pause, moving directly to where Charles stood among his courtiers. She knelt before him and spoke words that would echo through history. "Most noble Lord Dauphin, I am Joan the Maid, and the King of Heaven sends you word by me that you will be anointed and crowned in the city of Reims, and you will be the lieutenant of the King of Heaven, who is King of France." The court was stunned. How had this peasant girl, who had never been to court before, seen through their deception so easily? Charles himself was shaken. He took Joan aside for a private conversation, and whatever she told him in those moments changed everything. She revealed to him a secret prayer that only he and God knew, convincing him that she was indeed sent by heaven. But even with the Dauphin's support, Joan faced enormous obstacles. The French military leaders were skeptical of taking orders from a teenage girl. The church authorities demanded that she be examined to ensure she was not a witch or heretic. Joan was subjected to weeks of questioning by theologians and scholars who tested her knowledge of Scripture and her claims of divine revelation. Through it all, Joan remained calm and steadfast. She answered every question with simple honesty, never claiming to be more than what she was, a servant of God sent to save France. When they asked her about her voices, she said simply, "I believe in what my Lord Saint Michael tells me as firmly as I believe in the Christian faith." Her sincerity and devotion eventually convinced even her most skeptical interrogators. The theological examination also revealed Joan's remarkable intelligence and wisdom. Though she could not read or write, she demonstrated an understanding of Scripture and theology that amazed learned scholars. When they tried to trap her with complex questions about church doctrine, she replied with such clarity and insight that they realized they were dealing with someone extraordinary. With the church's blessing secured, Joan was given a suit of white armor and a banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary. She was also given a sword, which she said the voices had told her to find buried behind the altar of the Church of St. Catherine in Fierbois. When messengers were sent to look for it, they found the sword exactly where Joan had said it would be, covered with rust but otherwise perfect. Joan's transformation from peasant girl to warrior saint was complete. She rode out from Chinon at the head of a relief army, her white armor gleaming in the sun, her banner streaming in the wind. The soldiers who had initially mocked her now followed her with growing confidence. There was something about Joan, her absolute certainty, her fearless courage, her unwavering faith, that inspired everyone around her. The siege of Orleans had been going on for 7 months when Joan arrived. The city was starving, its walls battered by English cannon, its people on the verge of surrender. The English had built a ring of fortifications around the city, cutting off all supply routes. It seemed impossible that the French could break through. But Joan had a plan that was as audacious as it was simple. Instead of trying to break the English siege lines, she would attack their strongest fortress directly. The English had built a massive fortification called Les Tourelles to guard the bridge over the Loire River. If Joan could capture it, she could open a supply route into the city. The assault on Les Tourelles began at dawn on May 7, 1429. Joan was in the thick of the fighting, climbing the siege ladders with her soldiers, calling out encouragement and prayers. When an English arrow struck her in the shoulder, she pulled it out herself and continued fighting. Her courage was infectious, and the French soldiers fought with a ferocity that surprised even their enemies. As the day wore on, the battle seemed to be turning against the French. The English defenders were fighting desperately, and the French assault was beginning to falter. Some of Joan's commanders suggested retreating, but Joan refused. She knew that this was the moment the voices had prepared her for. "Forward!" she cried, raising her banner high. "God has given us the victory." Inspired by her words, the French soldiers surged forward one last time. The English line broke, and Les Tourelles fell. Within hours, the entire English siege was abandoned. Orleans was free, and Joan had accomplished what seasoned military commanders had thought impossible. The victory at Orleans transformed Joan from a curiosity into a hero. Across France, people began to call her the Maid of Orleans, the savior sent by God to liberate their land. Soldiers flocked to her banner, and cities that had been loyal to the English began to switch sides. The psychological impact of her victory was even greater than the military one. Joan's success continued with a series of brilliant victories. She captured the English fortress of Jargeau, defeating the famous English commander Suffolk. At the Battle of Padé, her forces surprised and routed an English army, killing over 2,000 enemies while losing only 3 men. Each victory seemed to confirm that God was indeed on her side. But Joan's ultimate goal was not just to win battles, it was to see the Dauphin crowned as the rightful king of France. She convinced Charles to march on Reims, the traditional coronation city of French kings. The journey was risky, as it meant crossing territory controlled by the English and Burgundians, but Joan was confident that the voices had promised her this moment. The coronation of Charles VII in Reims Cathedral on July 17, 1429, was the pinnacle of Joan's earthly mission. She stood beside the altar in her white armor, holding her banner, as the Archbishop of Reims placed the crown of Charlemagne on Charles's head. The great cathedral was packed with nobles, soldiers, and common people, all witnessing the fulfillment of Joan's prophecy. When the ceremony was complete, Joan knelt before the newly crowned king and wept tears of joy. "Noble king," she said, "now is God's pleasure fulfilled, who wished me to raise the siege of Orleans and to lead you to this city of Reims to receive your holy coronation, showing that you are the true king and the one to whom the kingdom of France must belong." It seemed that Joan had achieved everything the voices had promised. France had a crowned king, Orleans was free, and the English were in retreat. But Joan's story was far from over. The voices had warned her that she would not last more than a year, and she knew that her greatest trials lay ahead. The beginning of Joan's downfall came at the siege of Compiègne in May 1430. The city was under attack by the Burgundians, French nobles, who had allied themselves with the English. Joan led a relief force to break the siege, but the mission went wrong from the start. Her attack was repulsed, and during the retreat, she was cut off from her forces. As Joan fought desperately to reach the city gates, A Burgundian archer grabbed her by her cloth of gold surcoat and pulled her from her horse. The girl who had seemed invincible was now a prisoner, captured by her own countrymen who had sold their souls to the English cause. Joan's capture was a disaster for the French cause and a triumph for the English. They had been trying to defeat the Maid of Orleans for over a year, and now they had her. But they knew they couldn't simply execute her. That would make her a martyr. Instead, they decided to destroy her reputation by proving that she was a witch and a heretic. Joan was sold to the English for £10,000, a fortune in medieval currency. She was taken to Rouen, the English stronghold in Normandy, where she was imprisoned in a tower and put on trial for heresy and witchcraft. The trial was a mockery of justice from the beginning, designed not to determine her guilt or innocence, but to provide a legal excuse for her execution. The trial lasted for months, with Joan facing a panel of church officials who were determined to find her guilty. They questioned her about her voices, her male clothing, her claim of divine mission. Joan defended herself with remarkable skill and courage, often turning the questions back on her accusers. When they asked her if she knew she was in God's grace, she replied, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there." But the outcome was never in doubt. Joan was condemned as a heretic and handed over to the secular authorities for execution. On May 30, 1431, she was led to the marketplace of Rouen, where a pyre had been built for her burning. She was just 19 years old. Even at the end, Joan maintained her faith and dignity. She asked for a cross to be held before her eyes so that she could see it through the flames. As the fire was lit, she called out the name of Jesus 6 times, and then her voice was silenced forever. An English soldier who witnessed the execution said later, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." Joan's death did not end her story. It transformed it. Within 25 years, the English had been driven from France, and Joan was recognized as a martyr and saint. Her trial was overturned, her name was cleared, and she was declared innocent of all charges. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. Joan of Arc's extraordinary life reminds us that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is not armies or gold, but the unshakable faith of a single individual. In just 2 years, a peasant girl who could not read or write changed the course of history and saved a kingdom. Her voices may have been silenced by the flames, but her legacy burns on, inspiring people to believe that with faith and courage anything is possible. What do you think about Joan's claim to hear voices from heaven? Do you believe her story, or do you think there might be other explanations for her remarkable achievements? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's discuss how this teenage peasant girl became one of history's most legendary figures. The keelboat groaned against the Missouri River's muddy current as Captain Meriwether Lewis stood at its bow, squinting into the endless expanse of prairie grass that stretched beyond the western horizon. It was May 14, 1804, and the Corps of Discovery was finally beginning their journey into the vast unknown territory that President Thomas Jefferson had just purchased from France. Behind Lewis, 29 men prepared for what would become the most important exploration in American history, a journey that would take them across an entire continent and change the fate of a naughty. The story of the Lewis and Clark expedition begins not with adventure, but with a bold political gamble. In 1803, President Jefferson had shocked the world by purchasing the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon Bonaparte for $15 million, doubling the size of the United States overnight. The purchase was controversial, with many Americans wondering if the young nation could afford such an enormous expense, and others questioning whether the Constitution even allowed such a massive acquisition of territory. But Jefferson was a man of vision who understood that America's destiny lay westward. He had long dreamed of finding a water route across the continent, a northwest passage that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and make America a global trading power. The Louisiana Purchase had given him the legal authority to explore these western lands, and he was determined to send an expedition to map the territory, establish trade with Native American tribes, and find that elusive water route to the Pacific. The man Jefferson chose to lead this expedition was Meriwether Lewis, his private secretary, and a fellow Virginian who shared his passion for exploration and natural science. Lewis was just 29 years old, but he had already served as an officer in the U.S. Army and had extensive experience in the wilderness. More importantly, he possessed the intelligence, courage, and leadership skills necessary for such a dangerous mission. Lewis knew he needed a partner for this expedition, someone he could trust completely and who could share the enormous responsibilities of leadership. He chose William Clark, a fellow Army officer and experienced frontiersman who had served with distinction in the Indian Wars. Clark was 4 years older than Lewis and had a reputation for being practical, level-headed, and skilled in dealing with Native Americans. The two men had known each other for years and had developed a deep mutual respect. The partnership between Lewis and Clark would prove to be one of the most successful in American history. Lewis was the intellectual, a student of botany, geology, and Native American languages who could navigate by the stars and conduct scientific experiments. Clark was the practical man, an excellent mapmaker, skilled negotiator, and natural leader who could manage the day-to-day operations of the expedition. Together, they complemented each other perfectly. Jefferson spent months preparing his explorers for their journey. He sent Lewis to Philadelphia to study with the nation's leading scientists, learning botany from Dr. Benjamin Smith Barton, medicine from Dr. Benjamin Rush, and astronomy from Andrew Ellicott. Lewis learned to identify plants and animals, treat injuries and diseases, and use complex instruments to determine his location. He also studied the vocabularies of Western Indian tribes and learned techniques for preserving specimens. The expedition's goals were ambitious beyond anything previously attempted by Americans. Jefferson instructed Lewis and Clark to map the Missouri River and find the most direct water route to the Pacific Ocean. They were to establish trade relationships with Native American tribes, collect scientific specimens, and gather information about the climate, soil, and natural resources of the Western territories. Most importantly, they were to demonstrate American sovereignty over the Louisiana Purchase by planting the flag wherever they went. Assembling the corps of discovery was a careful process. Lewis and Clark needed men who were strong, skilled, and reliable, men who could handle the rigors of wilderness travel and the dangers of encountering potentially hostile Native American tribes. They selected soldiers from frontier army posts, choosing men who were expert hunters, skilled with boats, and experienced in dealing with Indians. The final group included sergeants, corporals, and privates, as well as civilian volunteers and interpreters. One of the most important members of the expedition was York, William Clark's enslaved man who had been his companion since childhood. York was a large, powerful man who proved invaluable as a hunter and laborer. His presence would have unexpected consequences during the journey, as many Native American tribes had never seen a black man before and viewed him with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. The expedition also included a French-Canadian trader named Toussaint Charbonneau and his teenage Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. Charbonneau was hired as an interpreter, but it was Sacagawea who would prove most valuable to the expedition. She had been kidnapped from her Shoshone tribe as a child and sold into slavery, eventually becoming Charbonneau's wife. Her knowledge of Western geography and her ability to communicate with Native American tribes would save the expedition on multiple occasions. The journey began at Camp Du Bois, near present-day St. Louis, where the expedition spent the winter of 1803 to 1804 preparing for their departure. Lewis and Clark drilled their men in military procedures, taught them to use scientific instruments, and gathered final supplies. They also interviewed traders and trappers who had ventured up the Missouri River, collecting whatever information they could about the lands ahead. When the Corps of Discovery finally set out on May 14, 1804, they were traveling into a world that was completely unknown to white Americans. The Missouri River, which they would follow for over 2,000 miles, was a treacherous waterway filled with hidden sandbars, fallen trees, and dangerous currents. The men had to paddle, and pull their boats upstream against the powerful current, making only a few miles on some days. The physical challenges were immense. The summer heat was oppressive, with temperatures reaching over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Swarms of mosquitoes and gnats made life miserable, covering the men's faces and hands with painful bites. The river itself seemed determined to stop them. Sandbars appeared overnight, forcing the men to unload their boats and drag them across shallow water. Fallen trees created dangerous obstacles that could crush a boat or trap it against the bank. Despite these hardships, the expedition made steady progress through what is now Missouri and Kansas. Lewis and Clark took detailed notes on everything they encountered: new species of plants and animals, the height and course of the river, the quality of the soil, and the locations of Native American villages. They were not just explorers, but scientists, carefully documenting their discoveries for posterity. Their first major encounter with Native Americans came in August 1804, when they met with representatives of the Oto and Missouri tribes near present-day Council Bluffs, Iowa. Lewis and Clark had prepared carefully for these meetings, bringing gifts of peace medals, flags, and trade goods. They also carried a message from President Jefferson, which they read to the assembled chiefs. "Children, I have learned that you are numerous. I have opened my heart to you. My voice is that of your father." The meeting was a success, establishing a pattern that Lewis and Clark would follow throughout their journey. They approached each tribe with respect and diplomacy, offering gifts and promising future trade relationships. They also demonstrated American military power by having their men perform military drills and firing their weapons. The combination of friendship and strength impressed most of the Native Americans they encountered. As they continued westward, the expedition entered the Great Plains, a vast grassland unlike anything they had ever seen. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, covered with buffalo grass that rippled in the wind like waves on an ocean. Herds of buffalo darkened the horizon, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands. The men had never seen such abundance of wildlife. Elk, deer, antelope, and countless species of birds filled the landscape. It was here that they encountered the Lakota Sioux, one of the most powerful tribes on the Great Plains. The meeting nearly ended in disaster when the Lakota chief demanded tribute for passage through their territory. Tensions escalated when the chiefs refused to let the expedition pass, and Clark drew his sword while Lewis ordered his men to prepare for battle. The standoff lasted for days, with both sides on the verge of violence. The crisis was resolved through careful diplomacy and the intervention of Chief Black Buffalo, who convinced the other chiefs to let the expedition pass. But the encounter demonstrated the dangers that lay ahead. The Lakota controlled much of the upper Missouri River, and they were not easily intimidated by American claims of sovereignty. As winter approached, the expedition reached the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes in present-day North Dakota. These tribes lived in permanent settlements along the Missouri River, growing corn, beans, and squash while also hunting buffalo on the surrounding plains. The Mandans and Hidatsas were friendly to the Americans, and Lewis and Clark decided to spend the winter with them, building Fort Mandan near their villages. The winter of 1804 to 1805 was one of the coldest on record, with temperatures dropping to 45 degrees below zero. The Missouri River froze solid, and the men had to chop through ice 4 feet thick to get water. Despite the harsh conditions, the expedition used the time productively, gathering information about the lands ahead and preparing for the next phase of their journey. It was during this winter that Sacagawea gave birth to her first child, a son named Jean-Baptiste. Lewis assisted with the difficult delivery, and the baby's arrival created a bond between the expedition members and their Shoshone interpreter. Sacagawea's presence would prove invaluable in the months ahead, as her knowledge of the western mountains and her ability to communicate with Native American tribes would save the expedition multiple times. When spring arrived, Lewis and Clark sent the keelboat back to St. Louis with specimens, maps, and reports for President Jefferson. They continued westward with a smaller party of 32 people, including Sacagawea and her infant son. The expedition now faced its greatest challenge, crossing the Rocky Mountains to reach the Pacific Ocean. The journey up the Missouri River through present-day Montana was both beautiful and treacherous. The landscape changed dramatically as they approached the mountains, with towering cliffs and spectacular rock formations rising from the river banks. Lewis named many of these landmarks, including the gates of the mountains, a narrow canyon where the river cut through towering limestone cliffs. But the river was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. The current was stronger, and the channel was filled with rocks and rapids that threatened to destroy their boats. The men had to portage around numerous waterfalls, carrying their boats and supplies over rough terrain. The most difficult portage was around the Great Falls of the Missouri, where the river dropped 400 feet in a series of spectacular waterfalls. The portage around the Great Falls took nearly a month and tested the expedition's endurance to its limits. The men had to carry their boats and supplies over 18 miles of rough terrain, using crude wooden wheels that constantly broke down. The July heat was overwhelming, and the men suffered from exhaustion, dehydration, and injuries. But they persevered, driven by Lewis and Clark's unwavering determination to complete their mission. As they continued westward, the expedition reached the Three Forks of the Missouri River, where the river divided into three separate streams. Sacagawea recognized the area. She had been captured by enemy raiders near this spot 5 years earlier. Her knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable as Lewis and Clark decided which fork to follow. They chose the Jefferson River, continuing southwest toward the Continental Divide. The expedition was now in Shoshone territory, and Lewis knew that they desperately needed to find Sacagawea's people. Without horses, they would never be able to cross the Rocky Mountains with their supplies. Lewis took a small party ahead to scout for the Shoshone, while Clark continued up the river with the main group. Lewis's encounter with the Shoshone was one of the most dramatic moments of the entire expedition. After days of searching, he finally spotted a group of Shoshone warriors on horseback. The meeting was tense. The Shoshone were suspicious of these strange white men who appeared suddenly in their territory. Lewis used sign language and gifts to communicate peaceful intentions, but the warriors remained wary. Everything changed when the main expedition arrived, and Sacagawea was reunited with her people. In an emotional scene that brought tears to the eyes of hardened frontiersmen, Sacagawea recognized the Shoshone chief as her own brother, Kamoe. The reunion transformed the negotiations, and the Shoshone agreed to provide the expedition with horses and guides for the mountain crossing. The crossing of the Rocky Mountains was the most difficult part of the entire journey. The expedition followed Indian trails through terrain that was almost impassable, with steep slopes, dense forests, and treacherous rocky puffs. The weather was harsh, with early snow and freezing temperatures that made travel miserable. The men were often hungry, forced to eat their horses and even candles to survive. The expedition nearly starved while crossing the Bitterroot Mountains. For 11 days, they struggled through what Clark called the most terrible mountains I ever beheld. The trail was so steep that horses fell and rolled down the mountainsides. The men were weak from hunger and exhaustion, and several became seriously ill. At one point, they were reduced to eating portable soup, a concentrated broth that was barely nutritious enough to keep them alive. Just when it seemed they might perish in the mountains, the expedition encountered the Nez Perce tribe, who saved them with food and shelter. The Nez Perce were generous hosts, providing the starving Americans with salmon, roots, and berries. However, the rich food after days of near starvation made many of the men violently sick, and the expedition had to rest for several days to recover. The Nez Perce also provided the expedition with dugout canoes for the next phase of their journey. Lewis and Clark left their horses with the tribe and continued westward down the Clearwater River, then the Snake River, and finally the Columbia River. The river travel was dangerous, with numerous rapids and waterfalls that threatened to destroy their canoes, but it was faster than overland travel. As they descended the Columbia River, the expedition entered a new world. The landscape changed from mountain forests to river valleys, and the climate became milder and more humid. They encountered new Native American tribes, the Yakama, Wasco, and Wishram, who had different cultures and customs than the Plains tribes they had met earlier. These river tribes were skilled fishermen who caught salmon in the Columbia's rapids using ingenious traps and nets. On November 7, 1805, Clark wrote in his journal the words that marked the achievement of their primary goal: "Great joy in camp. We are in view of the ocean, this great Pacific Ocean which we have been so long anxious to see." After 18 months and over 4,000 miles of travel, the Corps of Discovery had finally reached the Pacific Ocean. The expedition established Fort Clatsop near present-day Astoria, Oregon, where they spent the winter of 1805 to 1806. The Pacific coast was a harsh environment, with constant rain, dense fog, and limited food supplies. The men were homesick and eager to return to their families, but they used the time to rest, repair their equipment, and prepare for the return journey. Lewis and Clark also used the winter to complete their scientific work, documenting the plants, animals, and Native American tribes they had encountered. They created detailed maps of their route, preserved specimens to send back to President Jefferson, and wrote extensive notes about the geography and natural resources of the Western Territories. The return journey began in March 1806 and proved to be even more challenging than the westward trip. The expedition had to retrace their steps across the Rocky Mountains, begin facing harsh weather and difficult terrain. At one point, they split into two groups to explore different routes, with Lewis leading one party north while Clark took another group south. This separation was risky, but it allowed them to gather more information about the Western Territories. The two groups reunited at the mouth of the Yellowstone River, and the expedition continued down the Missouri River towards St. Louis. The return journey was faster than the westward trip, as they were now traveling with the current instead of against it. They also had better knowledge of the river and its hazards, allowing them to avoid many of the problems that had slowed their progress on the westward journey. On September 23, 1806, the Corps of Discovery arrived in St. Louis to a hero's welcome. The expedition had been gone for over 2 years, and many people had given them up for dead. Their return was celebrated throughout the nation, and Lewis and Clark became instant celebrities. They had accomplished something that many thought impossible. They had crossed the entire continent and returned to tell the tale. The Lewis and Clark expedition had far-reaching consequences for American history. Their detailed maps and reports provided the first accurate information about the Western Territories, encouraging thousands of settlers to move west. Their peaceful relations with most Native American tribes established trade relationships that would last for decades. Most importantly, their successful journey demonstrated that the Pacific Ocean was accessible from the United States, supporting American claims to the Oregon Territory. The expedition also had a profound impact on the men who participated in it. Lewis struggled with depression and died under mysterious circumstances in 1809, possibly by suicide. Clark went on to become a territorial governor and Indian agent, spending the rest of his life working with Native American tribes. Sacagawea returned to her people but later moved to a Missouri River trading post, where she died in 1812. York, Clark's enslaved companion, was eventually freed and may have returned to live with the Crow tribe. The scientific discoveries made by Lewis and Clark were remarkable. They identified over 300 new species of plants and animals, including the grizzly bear, mountain goat, and prairie dog. They collected thousands of specimens that were sent back to President Jefferson and studied by scientists around the world. Their detailed observations of Native American cultures provided valuable ethnographic information that helped preserve knowledge of these societies. Perhaps most importantly, the Lewis and Clark expedition embodied the American spirit of exploration and discovery. At a time when the United States was still a young nation struggling to establish its identity, Lewis and Clark showed that Americans could undertake great adventures and achieve extraordinary goals. Their journey across the continent demonstrated that the American frontier was not a barrier to be feared, but a challenge to be embraced. The legacy of Lewis and Clark continues to inspire Americans today. Their expedition represents the best of American values: courage, determination, scientific curiosity, and respect for other cultures. They showed that with proper preparation, strong leadership, and unwavering dedication, even the most ambitious goals can be achieved. Standing on the banks of the Missouri River today, it's hard to imagine the courage it took for 33 people to venture into the complete unknown with only their wits, their skills, and their faith in each other. Lewis and Clark's journey reminds us that the greatest discoveries often require the greatest risks, and that the unknown territories we fear most might hold the keys to our future. What aspect of the Lewis and Clark expedition do you find most inspiring? Their scientific discoveries, their diplomatic skills with Native American tribes, or their sheer determination to complete their mission? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss how this incredible journey helped shape the America we know today. As we reach the end of our journey through these three remarkable stories, we can see how individual courage and determination have shaped the course of Western civilization. From the banks of the Rubicon to the flames of Rouen, from the Missouri wilderness to the Pacific shore, we've witnessed how ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances can change the world forever. Julius Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon reminds us that sometimes the greatest achievements require the greatest risks. His decision to march on Rome with his legions was a gamble that could have ended in disaster, but his courage and political genius transformed the Roman Republic into an empire that would dominate the Western world for centuries. Caesar's story teaches us that leadership often means making difficult decisions with incomplete information, and that true greatness sometimes requires us to bet everything on our vision of the future. Joan of Arc's brief but extraordinary life shows us the power of unshakable faith and moral conviction. A teenage peasant girl who could neither read nor write became the savior of France because she believed absolutely in her divine mission. Her story reminds us that the greatest obstacles can be overcome when we have complete faith in our cause, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a sword or cannon, but the unwavering belief that we are fighting for something greater than ourselves. The Lewis and Clark expedition demonstrates what human beings can achieve when they work together toward a common goal. For over 2 years, 33 people from different backgrounds and cultures traveled across an entire continent, facing dangers and hardships that would have defeated lesser men. Their success came not from individual heroism, but from teamwork, careful planning, and mutual respect. Their story teaches us that the greatest adventures are often shared ones, and that the unknown territories we fear most might hold the keys to our future. What connects these three stories across the centuries is the human capacity for courage in the face of the unknown. Whether crossing a river, hearing voices from heaven, or venturing into uncharted wilderness, each of our heroes had to overcome their fears and doubts to achieve something extraordinary. They remind us that history is not made by forces beyond our control, but by individuals who choose to act with courage and conviction. These stories also show us how individual actions can have consequences that echo through the ages. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon led to the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the empire. Joan's victories saved France and helped create the modern nation-state. Lewis and Clark's expedition opened the American West and set the stage for the country's expansion to the Pacific. Each of these moments seemed small at the time, but they changed the course of history. As we face our own challenges in the modern world, these historical examples can inspire us to think bigger, act bolder, and believe more deeply in our ability to make a difference. We may not be called to cross rivers with armies, lead nations to victory, or explore unknown continents, but we all face moments when we must choose between safety and greatness, between comfort and adventure, between the known and the unknown. The courage of Caesar, Joan, and Lewis and Clark lives on in everyone who chooses to take risks for a greater cause, who stands up for what they believe in despite overwhelming odds, and who ventures into uncharted territory in pursuit of knowledge and discovery. Their legacy reminds us that each of us has the potential to change the world if we have the courage to try. What story from history inspires you most? Have you ever faced a Rubicon moment in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories from history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And remember, the greatest adventures in history started with a single step into the unknown. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep believing in the power of human courage to change the world.